For this section, we want to figure out how to work with negative exponents. So before we do that rule for x to the negative n, let's actually learn from this. Because if I did this as x squared over x to the fifth, well, that would be x times x over 5 factors of x. And in that case, right, you're still going to get these x's to cancel out, 2 of them. But this time, where are they left over? Well, they're left over on bottom. So you're still subtracting the exponents, right? But that would have been left over on bottom. Had I subtracted x to the 2 minus 5, that would give us x to the negative 3. So that's the same problem. So if you have a negative exponent, that just really means everything gets flipped down, left over on the bottom. So our rule, x to the negative n, would be a 1 over x to the positive n. So it kind of has a reciprocal effect. So this would be 1 over 2 cubed, because that base gets flipped down. Here there's parentheses, so that negative flips down with it. So 1 over negative 4 to the 1, which would end up just being 1 over negative 4, or negative 1/4. And in this case, notice the x has a negative exponent, so it flips, but the y stays up top. It doesn't have a negative exponent. So x to the fifth is now on bottom. And this last one, the parentheses are around it, so it would be 1 over x squared y to the first, but anything to the first power is itself. So that would just be 1 over x squared y. So that negative exponent, since there were parentheses, affects both bases, the x squared and the y. Okay, so this one here looks like we're combining a few of our properties from the last section. Remember the y to the third power, right? That's 3 groups of 3, so that would be y to the 9th. And then the next one, x to the 4th, but then the y to the negative 7, so that would be x to the 4th over y to the 7th times 2x y to the 5th. All right, so if I multiply, well, let's say actually I need to cancel out, right? The y to the 7th would cancel out with 7 of those 9 factors, leaving you with y squared. And then you multiply what's left, you would have 2x to the 5th, because that's x to the 4th times x, and then y squared times y to the 5th. That's 2 factors of y times 5 more factors of y, so that's a total of 7 factors. All right, let's work with this one here. This one kind of have a few things to deal with. Why don't I just write the fraction line and kind of start piecing together a few things. I'm just going to leave that negative 8, x to the 9th, the 4, and then x to the 4th to the 5th, that's 5 groups of 4, so x to the 20th. And then I kind of held off on those y's because I wanted to talk about the negative exponent. The y to the negative 3 up top flips down as y to the positive 3 on bottom. The y to the negative 1 on bottom actually flips up to be y to the first. All right, so now I can simplify. The 4 goes into 8 twice, so that would be negative 2 over, well, it looks like the cancellation would happen where the x's are left over on bottom. So you subtract the exponents, but it would be more left over on bottom, so x to the 11th down below, and y squared, because again, one of the y's would cancel out of the 3, and then leaving you with 2. All right, so what about these? We kind of saw this a little bit with some numbers and negatives, but if I have x times y to the fourth, that ends up being x times y, xy, xy, xy. So then x times x times x times x would be x to the fourth. Same with the y's to the fourth. So you can actually see that that exponent just gets multiplied through times the power that was there. So x, y to the fourth is x to the fourth, y to the fourth. This would be similar here. Negative 2 over y times itself again. So negative 2, negative 2, negative 2, that would be negative 8 over y cubed. So in general, x, y to the n would be x to the n, y to the n. And x over y to the n would be x to the n over y to the n. Okay, so let's try that property here. So for the first one, I'm squaring 3 x to the fourth, y to the negative 3. So that would be 3 squared times x to the fourth squared times y to the negative 3 squared. And then the next one would be negative 2 to the negative 3, x to the negative 3, and y to the negative 3 to the negative 3. So that power goes through to each of them. So here we go. We got 9. And then remember, x to the fourth squared. That's 2 groups of 4. So that would be x to the 8th, right? 2 groups of 4. And for the y here, you have 2 groups of negative 3. So that would be y to the negative 6. Let's deal with the negative exponents on this next part, because that would then end up being 1 over negative 2 cubed. And the x to the negative 3 would flip down also. And we got to watch this one. This would be a power to a power, so we multiply those exponents. But a negative 3 times negative 3 would be y to the, nope, not ninth. No, that was right. Y to the ninth. Negative 3 times negative 3. All right, a little bit more to, I'm going to skip that example and just do that last one instead. Use this space to finish this one. So 9 x to the 8th over y to the 6th. And then I would have a negative 2 cubed. So that would be negative 8 x cubed. And then that y to the 9th would be up top still. All right. So the negative 9/8. All right. And then I got to match up my variables here, the x's, right? Get those matched up. So x to the 8 over x cubed. So 3 of those would cancel. That'd be x to the 5th. And get those y's. I've got 9 on top, 6 on bottom. So 3 would be left over. Y cubed. There's that. That one's got a bunch of little details. They are a little tricky at first. You'll get some practice in the homework. All right. One more. Yeah, I guess there's a few ways to go about this one. Remember that negative exponent? That's like a reciprocal effect. So I could just kind of flip everything. Let me back that up. I think I'll work with the stuff in the parentheses first. Maybe that's the way to go. So we got a fraction. X to the negative 2 flips down to be x squared on bottom. We had an x to the 4th on bottom that stays. We have a y squared up top. That y to the negative 3 that was on bottom flips up to be y to the positive 3. And then all that to the negative 3. So then we would have let's see, y to the 5th over x to the 6th, all to the negative 3. So then that would be y to the 5th to the negative 3 over x to the 6th to the negative 3. And these would each be powers to a power, so we multiply the exponents. Y to the negative 15, x to the negative 18. And one last step to clear out those negative exponents, they both flip. So now you got y to the 15th on bottom and x to the 18th on top. That one was kind of a doozy there because we had negatives and then more negatives that had multiple rounds of flipping.